Hey, Katie. So, again, we have Nancy Drew, The Hidden Staircase, and we are on chapter 12, The Newspaper Clue. Miss Skade grabbed Nancy. Do you feel ill? The nurse asked quickly. Oh, I'll be all right, Nancy replied. This news has been a great shock to me. Is there any way I can help you? The woman questioned. I'd be very happy to. Thank you, but I guess not, the young sleuth said. Smiling ruefully, she added, But I must get busy and do something about this. The nurse suggested that perhaps Mr. Drew was in one of the local hospitals. She gave Nancy the names of the 3 in town. I'll get in touch with them at once, the young detective said. You've been most kind. And here comes your train, Miss Skade. Goodbye, and again, thanks a million for your help. Harry climbed out of his taxi and went to stand at the platform to signal passengers for his cab. Nancy hurried after him, and before the train came in, asked if he would please give her a description of the 2 men who had been with her father. Well, both of them were dark and kind of athletic looking. Not what I'd call handsome. One of them had an upper tooth missing, and the other fellow, his left ear was kind of crinkled, if you know what I mean. I understand, said Nancy. I'll give a description of the 2 men to the police. She went back to the telephone booth and called each of the 3 hospitals, asking if anyone by the name of Carson Drew had been admitted, or possibly a patient who was not conscious and had no identification. Only Mercy Hospital had a patient who had been unconscious since the day before. He was definitely not Mr. Drew. He was Chinese. Sure, now that her father was being held in some secret hiding place, Nancy went at once to police headquarters and related the taximan's story. Captain Rosalind looked extremely concerned. This is alarming, Miss Drew, he said. But I feel sure we can trace that fellow with the crinkly ear, and we'll make him tell us where your father is. I doubt, though, that there's anything you can do. You'd better leave it to the police. Nancy said nothing. She was reluctant to give up, even trying to do something, but she acquiesced. In the meantime, said the officer, I'd advise you to remain at Twin Elms and concentrate on solving the mystery there. From what you tell me about your father, I'm sure he'll be able to get out of the difficulty himself, even before the police find him. Aloud, Nancy promised to stay on call in case Captain Rosalind might need her. But in her own mind, the young sleuth determined that if she got any kind of lead concerning her father, she was most certainly going to follow it up. Nancy left police headquarters and strolled up the street, deep in thought. Instead of things getting better, all my problems seem to be getting worse. Maybe I'd better call Hannah. Since she had been a little girl, Nancy had found solace in talking to Hannah Gruen. The housekeeper had always been able to give her such good advice. Nancy went into a drugstore and entered one of the telephone booths. She called the Drew house in River Heights and was pleased when Mrs. Gruen answered. The housekeeper was aghast to learn Nancy's news, but said she thought Captain Rosalind's advice was sound. You've given the police the best leads in the world, and I believe that's all you can do. But wait, the housekeeper suddenly said. If I were you, Nancy, I'd call up those railroad lawyers and tell them exactly what happened. Oops. Your father's disappearance is directly concerned with that bridge project, I'm sure, and the lawyers may have some ideas about where to find him. That's a wonderful suggestion, Hannah, said Nancy. I'll call them right away. But when the young detective phoned the railroad lawyers, she was disappointed to learn that all the men were out to lunch and none of them would return before 2:00. Oh dear, Nancy sighed. Well, I guess I'd better get a snack while waiting for them to come back. But in her worried state, she did not feel like eating. There was a food counter at the rear of the drugstore, and Nancy made her way to it. Perching on a high-backed stool, she read the menu over and over. Nothing appealed to her. When the counterman asked what she wanted, Nancy said frankly that she did not know. She was not very hungry. Then I recommend our split pea soup, he told her. It's homemade and out of this world. Nancy smiled at him. I'll take your advice and try it. The hot soup was delicious. By the time she had finished it, Nancy's spirits had risen considerably. And how about some custard pie? The counterman inquired. It's just like Mother used to make. All right, Nancy answered, smiling at the solicitous young man. So solicitous is like he's happy to help. And very polite. The pie was ice cold and proved to be delicious. When Nancy finished eating it, she glanced at her wristwatch. It was only 1:30. Seeing a rack of magazines, she decided to while away the time reading in her car. She purchased a magazine of detective stories, one of which proved to be so intriguing that half an hour went by quickly. Promptly at 2 o'clock, Nancy returned to the phone booth and called the offices of the railroad lawyers. The switchboard operator connected her with Mr. Anthony Barradale, and Nancy judged from his voice that he was fairly young. Quickly she told him her story. "Mr. Drew being held a prisoner!" Mr. Barradale cried out. "Well, those underhanded property owners are surely going to great lengths to gain a few dollars." "The police are working on the case, but I thought perhaps your firm would like to take a hand also," Nancy told the lawyer. "We certainly will," the young man replied. "I'll speak to our senior partner about it. I know he will want to start work at once on the case." "Thank you," said Nancy. She gave the address and telephone number of Twin Elms and asked that the lawyers get in touch with her there if any news should break. "We'll do that," Mr. Barradale promised. Nancy left the drugstore and walked back to her car. Climbing in, she wondered what her next move ought to be. "One thing is sure," she thought. "Work is the best antidote for worry. I'll get back to Twin Elms and do some more sleuthing there." As she drove along, Nancy reflected about the ghost entering Twin Elms mansion by a subterranean passage, so under the earth. Since she had found no sign of anyone in the outbuildings on the estate, it occurred to her that it possibly led from an obscure cave, either natural or man-made. Such a device would be a clever artifice for an architect to use. Taking a little used road that ran along one side of the estate, Nancy recalled having seen a long, grassed-over hillock which she had assumed to be an old aqueduct. Perhaps this was actually the hidden entrance to Twin Elms. She parked her car at the side of the road and took a flashlight from the glove compartment. In anticipation of finding the answer to the riddle, Nancy crossed the field, and as she came closer to the beginning of the huge mound, she could see stones piled up. Getting nearer, she realized that it was indeed the entrance to a rocky cave. "Well, maybe this time I've found it," she thought, hurrying forward. The wind was blowing strongly and tossed her hair about her face. Suddenly, a freakish gust swept a newspaper from across the rocks and scattered the pages helter-skelter. Nancy was more excited than ever. The newspaper meant a human being had been here not too long ago. The front page sailed toward her. As she grabbed it up, she saw to her complete astonishment that the paper was a copy of the River Heights Gazette. The date was the Tuesday before. "Someone interested in River Heights had been here very recently," the young sleuth said to herself excitedly. Who was the person? Her father? Gomber? Who? Wondering if the paper might contain any clue, Nancy dashed around to pick up all the sheets. As she spread them out on the ground, she noticed a hole in the page where the classified ads appear. "This might be a very good clue," Nancy thought. "As soon as I get back to the house, I'll call Hannah and have her look up Tuesday's paper to see what was in that ad." It suddenly occurred to Nancy that the person who had brought the paper to the cave might be inside at that very moment. She must watch her step. He might prove to be an enemy. "This may be where Dad is being held prisoner," Nancy thought wildly. Flashlight in hand, and her eyes darting intently about, Nancy proceeded cautiously into the cave. 5 feet, 10, she saw no one. 15 more, 20. Then Nancy met a dead end. The empty cave was almost completely round and had no other opening. "Oh dear, another failure," Nancy told herself disappointedly as she retraced her steps. "My only hope now is to learn something important from the ad in the paper." Nancy walked back across the field. Her eyes were down as she automatically looked for footprints, but presently she looked up and stared in disbelief. A man was standing alongside her car, examining it. His back was half turned toward Nancy, so she could not see his face very well. But he had an athletic build, and his left ear was definitely crinkly.